Hi. There's a lot of people who voted still support Corbyn and who support Labour, who are pro-Remain or who are on the side of Leave, but they definitely don't want a hard Brexit. They want a favourable deal. People who are in favour of a second referendum. A lot of these people now are feeling very confused about which way to go next. The whole of the Labour Party members now are being distracted with this hustle for a new leader, and there's big arguments about that, when really what we need to be focusing on right now are the future for millions and millions of British citizens, and especially the children and youth of Britain, and also the impact of our nation within global politics and our impact on the environment and climate. These are very, very important issues that cannot be brushed aside, and we cannot be distracted by arguing about who's now going to lead the Labour Party and who the Labour Party really represents. All these things are irrelevant because people's lives are on the line and our planet is on the line here. And the kind of consciousness that has been liberated in Britain right now, this is it. A guy 6 stone in weight, denied his benefits, reduced to 6 stone in weight, he's already ill, ends up dying. DWP says it followed policy. It turns out that DWP's policies are no different to the policies of Auschwitz. Okay? They're no different to the policies of Auschwitz. That's exactly the same level of decisions that the Nazis running Auschwitz levelled against their inmates. It didn't matter how ill, how sick, how weak, how emaciated they were still fit for work in the concentration camp, factory prisons, because that's what they did. Schindler's List, or the book Schindler's Ark, explains it all very thoroughly. So we are dealing with a nation that is operating along with the same policies as the Nazis of Auschwitz, right? This is what the EU needs to remember when it's thinking about doing a deal with Boris Johnson. So now my proposal is this, that look, we need a second referendum. The first referendum was fraudulent in every sense of the word, financially, morally, ethically, the lies that were told, the employment of a foreign corporate social engineering firm whose, methods include blackmail and bribery, threats. No, there needs to be a second referendum, and the EU now has a duty to put its foot down and say no, that we are not going to commit to any deal with you, Mr. Boris Johnson, or your government, or any government in Britain, until the British people have had the benefit of a second referendum, which will be heavily and closely monitored by external bodies like UN rapporteurs and EU officials, to make sure that the referendum is secure and that no lies are told, and that the British people are fully informed about what they're voting for and what they're voting against. And the British people, now, I ask you to get behind this motion to demand a second referendum, and that the EU supports us in that as a duty of care. So I'm going to read you this short piece for the benefit of people who are only partially sighted or are blind. And I ask you to please share it with people and send it to your Labour MPs, send it to Jeremy Corbyn, send it to the EU. I've already sent it to the EU. You send it as well. Share it with your friends. Talk about it. We have a right to a second referendum, because I am sick and tired of hearing about how Boris Johnson is supporting democracy on strength of such a fraudulent referendum that was Brexit. An appeal to EU Parliament on behalf of British EU citizens. Britain and the EU are presently brokering UK's exit from the EU, and on strength of a referendum held in 2016, in which UK citizens voted leave by a small majority of just 4%. A minority lead very likely gained through a variety of criminal activities on side of the Tory-led Leave campaign, i.e. financial corruption, blatant lies, invasion of voter privacy, collusion with hostile foreign powers, i.e. Russia and far-right governments, in Hungary, USA, Israel. While EU officially accepts both USA and Israel as allies, the reality is that both nations are presently governed by forces of power which are hostile to all of the laws and rights presently upheld by the EU, and even against the power of the EU Free Trade Union bloc itself. In this sense, Israel and USA governments have shown their true face to the European Union and every nation within it, inasmuch as they have abused their powers to commit and cover up numerous terrible crimes, all committed for purpose of looting and controlling every nation, and in that process stripping away democracy, rights, law, etc. The end objective appears to be finalisation of a new world order imposing corporate feudalism over a serf global populace set to run via a two-tier system of one law for the few and another law for the many. Fact is, we are currently already experiencing the explicit reality of that dual law system. Criminal bankers and government ministers are allegedly too big to prosecute. The point is, we do presently still have the legal power to address all such predatory powers and simultaneously uphold and strengthen EU law and also apply it. i.e., why is Israel, in light of their gross crimes against humanity, permitted to remain associated within the EU bloc? A nation is only as good as its leaders, and when an alleged democracy throws up fascists who oppress even their own populace, we understand that those nations are no longer lawfully recognised as democratic, and due to the fundamental fact that democracy is implemented for the specific purpose of prohibiting fascism. Will Israel be giving up on all the advantages it currently enjoys via EU? If not, then why not, considering Israel's government has been a key force of power behind the push for a UK hard Brexit, which does ultimately seek to undermine the EU? Something is very wrong when the political choices within a democracy amount to a choice between criminal liars or else they're less criminal and slightly more honest complicits. Something has gone badly wrong when an allegedly free press has opted to remain non-biased and give equal balance to both criminal fiction and lawful fact, and on behalf of satisfying largely foreign interests and agendas. It gets downright disturbing when the free press consistently fails as a matter of public interest and even national security to expose within the context of a general election all of the extreme risks associated with those hoping to profit from their crimes and fictions. Lies and slanders against a for once humane sane opposition are rarely challenged with facts, presumably because that would show bias. Instead, the lies are repeated on national news programmes against the opposition, e.g. Jeremy Corbyn is repeatedly asked to apologise for his alleged and actually non-existent anti-Semitism. Through ignoring, i.e. Israeli crimes against Palestinian people and citizens of Lebanon, Syria, etc., the EU is opening the doors to an equally lacked respect for EU citizens' human rights, and to such a degree UK David Cameron, I am a Zionist PM, could casually announce his plans to scrap human rights, and then later, after imposing an uncalled for, socially divisive Brexit referendum on the UK public, more proposals for acts in every single law relating to workers' rights, women's rights, environmental rights, health and safety rights. EU members are surely fully aware that Brexit is about the single issue of defending Britain's corporate Crown territory tax havens from EU anti-tax avoidance laws. Since Britain's Crown territories, which includes the square mile of central London, are not part of the EU, these are lawfully recognised as foreign powers and interests, none of which adhere to EU principles of democracy, i.e. Jersey has never held a general election. By August 2019, it became very clear that the majority of UK citizens do not want Brexit, and certainly not a hard Brexit. Over 1 million people have twice marched through London, and tens of thousands in every town and city across Britain as an impromptu protest against Johnson's unlawful proroguing of Parliament and in support of remaining within the EU. We have yet to witness anything remotely close to the equivalent in support of Brexit. Despite all of the risks, evidence and crimes exposed via links as shared in references at conclusion of this article, for some inexplicable reason, UK Parliament continued to tolerate Johnson PM and his government to remain in office and thereafter to oversee a general election. This was in direct ignorance of all the evidence exposing a criminal coup, evidence which includes a Supreme Court judgment that found Mr Johnson PM guilty of abusing his powers to unlawfully shut down Parliament, democracy, for purpose of getting Brexit done by October 31st. Some, including myself, had expressed alarm about permitting a criminal government to run a GE, weighing up the risk against a global network of criminal interests as opposed to the benefits and interests EU membership assures and delivers to UK citizens. It was very clear that Johnson PM and co were not only capable of breaking the law to run a rigged election, they had, after aforementioned Supreme Court judgment, publicly stated that it was their full intention to break the law again, to get Brexit done. In light of all the above, UK's December 12, 2019 GE result is highly suspect, and already evidence is piling enough to validate what amounts to lawful suspicion. See the postal votes. Britain's postal vote system is wide open to abuse, and it is of major concern that counting of postal votes is performed by a corporate entity with direct financial connections to leading Tory party members. Hence, a BBC reporter was at liberty a day before the GE to publicly disclose on BBC News strong hints about results of the postal vote via her connections to a Tory minister. Johnson's alleged landslide victory is claimed to be the result of a successful media attack against Corbyn. While this is very likely true for the Brexit referendum, by now the British public are fully aware of how they've been tricked by such methods. And, in spite of the mass propaganda against Mr Corbyn, thousands came out to show their support wherever he appeared. When one examines the facts, the landslide victory makes no sense. The public knew that a vote for Johnson would put a hard Brexit back on the table and put millions of UK citizens' rights, livelihoods and lives at risk under 50 years austerity. The public has shown conclusively that support for Brexit has dramatically dwindled, and yet that same public voted by a landslide for Mr Johnson, a man who dare not show his face in public nor even attend TV debates and interviews, whose manifesto was "Get Brexit done" and "Stop Corbyn." It is very probable that Mr Johnson knew he had no need to participate in the usual campaign activities because he already felt confident he would win by a landslide, because he and his associates were busy preparing to rig the result in their favour. Perhaps Mr Johnson had received a few directives from the Hungarian officials who visited the same building where Mr Johnson was holding a cabinet meeting on the issue of getting Brexit done. Hungary's far-right government received full backing from former UK PM Miss May. It has recently been reported that investigations into Hungary's general election have exposed solid evidence of vote rigging. The UK government are now claiming that turnout for this recent GE was low, when in fact people operating the polling stations throughout Britain were reporting record attendance. Millions of people had registered to vote, many of whom had never voted for years, and also many young people voting for the first time, people who were too young to vote in the referendum and who, as a social group, are known to be predominantly pro-EU. Another narrative being pushed online via Twitter, etc., is that the landslide win is due to very poor people voting Tory. Various news providers have been broadcasting interviews with food bank users, impoverished disabled people and low-paid zero-hour contract workers, NHS staff, etc., all stating they voted for Boris. Apparently, a handful of such interviews speak for the whole of Britain. Strange how they couldn't find anyone who voted for Corbyn. This particular narrative is particularly nasty, as it seeks to draw public attention onto the usual scapegoats, i.e. the poorest and most vulnerable. We can focus our despair and disgust onto an already heavily oppressed social class, blame them for giving the Tories a landslide, as opposed to questioning the security of this GE and the validity of the result. Also, why would BBC, etc., feel the need to go around identifying Tory voters from among the most impoverished British citizens unless they were continuing to assist a criminal government via helping to confirm their narratives about how Johnson received a landslide victory? Johnson had to win by a landslide in order to have full control of Parliament in order to get Brexit done. EU duty of care. It is beholden on the EU to recognise the immense risk now facing the UK public as a captive populace at mercy of what amounts to a criminal cabal, and also the resulting threat against Europe's hard-won free trade union. As EU citizens, British people's only hope now is that EU Parliament honours their duty of care toward upholding the rights of all EU citizens and thereby refuses to commit to any Brexit deal or even to permit Brexit until such a time as the UK public have had a second referendum, and this time one which is carefully monitored and with a commitment to ensuring the British public are fully and accurately informed about exactly what they are voting for or against. While there remains the risk that Johnson PM will simply leave the EU anyway, the UK public will at least have solid EU backing towards standing up in protest and in support of calling for a second referendum and or to oust the Tory criminals from office and simultaneously demand arrests and investigations. Should the UK public fail to engage in any such action, the EU will have no choice except to cut all economic, political and military relations with Britain until such time as Britain is governed by a law-abiding party which upholds human rights. Regardless of which political party has been in office, the UK public have paid their dues into the EU and have by majority honoured EU law and rights. The British public did not collectively request a referendum about leaving the EU. No mass demonstrations demanding to leave the EU have ever taken place in Britain, and not even after the Brexit referendum. There is no doubt on the fact that calls to leave the EU arose almost entirely from senior ranks within the Tory party, namely financial and corporate business interests, all suddenly deeply alarmed by the fast approaching EU tax regulations. Surely the EU is legally and ethically obliged to protect the interests and rights of its citizenship over and above the rights of a criminal cabal established by a criminal coup and lawfully suspect elections. On facing EU demands that British people receive the benefit of a second referendum as a matter of legal principle and EU commitment to ensuring all EU citizens' rights to democracy, the present UK government will be forced to shoulder full responsibility for the resulting hard Brexit instead of being at liberty to claim they are honouring democracy via delivering their hard Brexit. For the sake of the children of Britain, the EU cannot now fail to recognise the severity of this extraordinary situation that is Brexit and the core force of corrupted power behind its impetus. In such circumstances, the EU has opportunity and the right to itself inform British citizens via public broadcast press conferences about, e.g., why EU Parliament is insisting on a second referendum, i.e., due to EU duty of care to ensure national populations are not being dragged out of the EU against their will by corrupted powers, only to become corporate slaves and stripped of all their rights in order to become a democracy-free zone stroke tax haven. While EU Parliament holds diplomatic relations with various EU national governments, a fundamental feature of those relations is that all governments are recognised as a democracy, and therefore each government represents the people of its nation. However, once a government is lawfully suspected of oppressing or denying democracy, and even proven to be committing crimes against democracy, all diplomacy has to be in favour of the abused and oppressed public suffering rule of any such despot power. With extreme far-right elements of UK society now joining forces with the present Tory government, and for the publicly stated purpose of securing Johnson's leadership for delivering Brexit, alarm bells are ringing. Britain First / English Defence League, led by ex-convict Tommy Robinson, are a party which has previously harassed, traumatised and attacked various minority communities and individuals across Britain. People have been left scarred for life, and some have lost their lives. This, coupled with proposals for martial law immediately after Brexit, presents severe risks against minority social groups and women and children. Again, can EU Parliament morally and ethically ignore those risks? At this very moment, many UK citizens are feeling literally terrified about what Johnson's government have planned, and the kind of consciousness now being liberated into social and political power. It is imperative that EU Parliament thoroughly examines the evidence as presented herein, and promptly acts to thwart what amounts to a fascist takeover of an EU nation, which in turn is backed and facilitated by a variety of very powerful global interests which have no EU membership and which are completely opposed to the EU as an entity. Already, as I write, this Tory government is selling off NHS hospitals and even British defence firms. Corporate militarisation needs to be a major concern for the whole of the EU. Mercenary armies, accountable to no one, are a threat far more serious than that once posed by the USSR, i.e. an armed body of power with no allegiance to law or rights and set to serve only the interest of their employers via troops who will kill for cash. Their weapons include social engineering and weaponised economic activities, i.e. Sajid Javid's proposed shock and awe strategy. What Singapore on the Thames visionaries appear to have in mind can be summed up as a commitment to sweeping tax cuts for corporations and mobile rich people, tax wars as a fiscal weapon. Tax measures such as accelerated capital allowances to attract mobile investments to UK, comprehensive deregulation, removal of social and environmental protections, weak or non-existent compliance with international anti-money laundering measures, retaining golden visa arrangements to provide residence rights of wealthy non-British citizens, increasing exposure to oligarchs and corrupt financial flows. We all know the end game, which is to erase all the social and economic progressions achieved after World War II, scrapping human rights, workers' rights, women and children's rights, environmental protections. It's akin to a gang of rapist thugs taking over the judiciary and granting themselves rights of ownership over every man, woman and child on this planet. And meanwhile, the Zionists get to complete their Greater Israel project, minus any credible voice of dissent. And I've left all the links under here, and I'll leave the link to this under this video. And you know, I ask people, this is what our country has come to. You know, this kind of far-right fascism. A guy screaming in this mother's face saying she should have had an abortion. And yet that same far-right fascism are screaming in women's faces because they're having abortions. Because this isn't a consciousness that works on any level of any level of sanity. Okay? It is absolute madness, craziness. Basically, if they can find an excuse to abuse somebody, to attack somebody, to intimidate somebody, to big themselves up, they'll use it. If they can get into a group of people and go abusing people on the strength that they're Muslim, or on the strength that they're a Jew, or on the strength that they're a woman, they will do it. Because they're people who enjoy hurting people. And that's what the law exists for, is to protect the majority of people who do not enjoy hurting people, who do not enjoy committing crimes against people, who don't want to rape women and children. That's what the law is there for. But at the moment, the law is protecting the people that want to abuse people. It's protecting the people who do this to British citizens. Apparently, this was lawful, what's happened to this man. The policies of Auschwitz are now the policies of Britain, as being applied to the poor and vulnerable, the sick and disabled. That's Nazism. And I am appealing to the EU to protect the British citizens, because no matter whichever way you look at it, well over half the people of Britain who vote, who are capable of voting, don't want to leave the EU. And then we've got all the children who are most at risk, and the EU has a duty of care, especially for children. Go and look at your child protection directives. London is already, even while we're in the EU, London is child abuse capital of the world, according to the United Nations Child Protection Committee. Did they get it wrong? How much worse is it going to get when we're out of the EU? And these people are literally free to do as they please. Look what they're doing already to British citizens. 200,000 by the beginning of 2020. It's estimated 200,000 dead through austerity. How many more are going to die? And in all this madness, I hope, as a British citizen and as an EU citizen, that EU Parliament is thinking about people like me, and is thinking about the people who I am speaking out for and on behalf of. And I just cannot understand how EU Parliament can even be contemplating any kind of deal with Boris Johnson when you know full well what that the British people, what we have been victims of, and what we are still victims of, and this fraudulent, actually criminal referendum campaign, the Leave campaign, was criminal every which way you look at it. Even the money that was donated to them, as some of it has connections to money laundering of blood diamonds. It's absolutely outrageous. The EU need now, EU Parliament, you need to stand by the British people. And I ask the British people, stand up and support this second referendum. You know, Boris might have got in with his rigged general election, as we lawfully suspect. He might have won himself a battle with his cheat. But we shall not stand by and allow him to win the war, because my grandfather has already won that war. And the children of Britain already have our rights, and we will stand up for them. And I ask the EU to stand with us. We need another second referendum.